The final bell shrieked, a sound that meant freedom for most, but for her, it was just the start of a different kind of work. It was the signal to begin the daily mission of becoming invisible. She would pull her textbooks a little tighter to her chest, a flimsy shield against the world, and start the long walk down the crowded hallway. It was a noisy ocean of laughing, shouting, and gossiping students, and she was just a small, quiet pebble on the floor, hoping not to be kicked. Her name was Anya, though not many people used it. To them, she was just that quiet girl or the one who's always reading. She didn't mind. Being a nameless ghost was safer than being a target, but safety was a fragile thing in high school. It could be shattered by a single look or a whispered word. And then there was Chloe. Chloe moved through the hallways like she owned them, a bright, loud sun with her own solar system of friends who orbited her, laughing at her jokes and echoing her opinions. Chloe's power wasn't in her muscles. It was in her smile, a sharp, glittering thing that could make you feel like the most important person in the world one moment and absolutely nothing the next. Anya had learned to avoid that smile, to keep her head down, her eyes on her worn sneakers, and just keep walking. Some days it was easier than others. On this particular afternoon, she was almost at the end of the hallway, almost to the freedom of the front doors when she saw them. Chloe and her two friends were leaning against a row of lockers right in her path. They weren't talking loudly, but their presence created a kind of force field, a wall of social energy that was impossible to ignore. Anya's heart gave a little thump against her ribs. She could turn around, go the long way, but that would look like she was running. So she kept walking, her eyes fixed on a crack in the linoleum floor just ahead of her dot as she got closer. She could hear their voices. "Oh my God, did you see what he was wearing?" One of them was saying. They didn't stop talking as she approached, forcing her to navigate around them. She tried to squeeze past, keeping her body small. Just as she was clear, Chloe stuck her foot out, not in a big, obvious trip, but just enough to catch the toe of Anya's sneaker. It was a small, clumsy thing. Anya stumbled forward, her books flying out of her arms and scattering across the floor with a series of loud, embarrassing smacks. The hallway seemed to go quiet for a second. Or maybe it was just the blood rushing in her ears. She could feel a hot blush creeping up her neck. She knelt down, her hands shaking as she gathered her things. She didn't look up. She didn't have to. She could hear the soft, smothered giggles. "Oops," Chloe said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Clumsy much? You should really watch where you're going." Anya just nodded, her throat too tight to form words. She could feel the eyes of other students on her, a mix of pity and amusement. It was the humiliation she hated most, being put on display like a sad little museum exhibit. She finally gathered the last book, clutching the pile to her chest like a life raft, and stood up. Without a glance back, she walked the remaining 10 feet to the doors and pushed out into the cool afternoon air. She took a deep, shaky breath, the crisp air doing little to cool the fire of shame on her cheeks, but she didn't go home. Not yet. She turned and walked around the side of the large brick building, to a door that was almost always hidden in shadow. This was her other route, her secret passage. She pulled the heavy metal door open and slipped inside. The air here was different. It was still and cool, smelling of dust, old wood, and something faintly like lemon polish. This was the old music room, a place mostly forgotten since the new, fancy arts wing was built. The band practiced here sometimes, but most days it was empty. And in the middle of the room, sitting like a sleeping black beast, was the grand piano. This was her sanctuary. This was the one place where she didn't have to be invisible. She walked across the squeaky wooden floor, her sneakers leaving faint tracks in the dust. She ran a hand over the smooth, cool lid of the piano, her fingers tracing the faint scratches and scuffs from years of use. It wasn't a shiny, perfect instrument. It was a warrior with stories to tell. She lifted the lid and gently unfolded the key cover. Revealing the yellowed ivory keys, she sat down on the worn bench, the familiar grooves a comfort under her. For a moment she just sat there, her hands resting in her lap. The anger from the hallway, the hot shame, the feeling of being small and worthless, it all swirled inside her. Her hands, which had been clenched into fists in her pockets, began to uncurl. She lifted them and placed them on the keys, her fingers finding their positions as naturally as breathing, and then she began to play. She didn't start with a gentle, pretty melody. She started with a storm. Her fingers flew across the keys, a torrent of angry, fast-paced notes that filled the dusty room. It was the sound of her frustration, the feeling of being tripped in the hallway, the sound of Chloe's fake sweet voice. The notes were sharp and loud, a protest against the silence she was forced to keep all day. She poured all of it into the music, every unspoken comeback, every moment she had wanted to scream but had only swallowed hard instead. The piano thundered, and for a few minutes she was not the quiet girl. She was a force of nature. Then, slowly, the storm began to pass. The angry notes softened, the tempo slowed. The music shifted into something else, a deep, sad melody that hung in the air like a sigh. This was the loneliness. This was the feeling of walking through a sea of people and feeling completely alone. It was the quiet ache of having so much to say and no one to say it to. Her fingers moved slowly now, caressing the keys, drawing out a sound so full of longing it made her own heart ache. It was in these moments that the tears would sometimes come. Not sad, crying tears, but just a release. A gentle letting go of all the weight she carried. She played for what felt like hours, moving from anger to sadness and then, finally, to something else. A new melody began to emerge, one that was softer, more hopeful. It was a secret tune she had been working on, a collection of notes that felt like a dream. It was the sound of what she wished her life could be, a life where she didn't have to hide. Where her hands could be this expressive and free all the time. Where she could walk down the hallway and not be afraid of who she might run into. This was her unspoken hope, her quiet rebellion, all translated into music. As she played the last few notes of her secret song, they hung in the air for a moment before fading into silence. The only sound was her own breathing. She sat there, her hands still resting on the keys, the lingering vibrations a comfort under her fingers. The anger and shame from the hallway were gone, replaced by a quiet strength. Out there, she was Anya, the invisible girl. But in here, in this dusty, forgotten room, she was a musician. She was a storyteller. She was heard. And for now, that was enough. The next few days at school felt different. A new kind of energy buzzed through the hallways, a current of excitement that seemed to touch everyone but her. It started with posters, splashes of neon pink and electric blue taped to every available wall. School talent show. They screamed in bold, bubbly letters. Are you the next star? For most students, it was a thrilling invitation. For Anya, it was a threat. Each poster she passed felt like a spotlight she desperately wanted to dodge. She saw clusters of students gathered around the sign-up table in the main hall, laughing and writing their names down, dreaming of their moment in the spotlight. Anya just pulled her hood up a little higher and walked faster, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Being invisible was a full-time job, and this talent show felt like math lay dash-offs. Of course, Chloe and her friends were at the center of the excitement. Anya saw them gathered around the sign-up table, not just signing up, but posing for pictures they were taking of each other, pouting their lips and throwing peace signs. They were going to do a dance routine to some popular song that was always playing on the radio. Anya had seen them practicing sometimes in the gym after school, a synchronized storm of high ponytails and confident moves. They were good in a way that demanded attention. They were everything Anya was not, loud, bold, and utterly without fear. It was a couple of days later, as Chloe and her friends were leaving practice one evening, that the seed of the cruel idea was planted. They were cutting through the quiet side of the building, a shortcut no one else really used, when they heard it. Faintly, from behind the heavy door of the old music room, came the sound of a piano. It wasn't the simple, plodding melody of a beginner. It was something complex and emotional, a torrent of beautiful, sad notes that seemed to make the air around them vibrate. They stopped dead in their tracks. Chloe's friend, a girl named Brianna, pointed at the door. "What is that?" she whispered. Chloe didn't answer. She just listened, a strange, thoughtful expression on her face. Anya had been so lost in her music she hadn't heard them approach. They never saw who was playing, but the sound itself was enough. It was a secret, and secrets were power. The next day, Chloe walked up to the talent show sign-up table with a purposeful stride. The teacher in charge, a kind but slightly overwhelmed man named Mr. Davison, was sorting through some papers. "Hi, Mr. Davison," Chloe said, her voice all sweetness and light. "I just need to add one more name to the list." She picked up the pen. "It's for my friend, Anya. She's a little shy, so she asked me to sign her up." Mr. Davison smiled, pleased that another student was participating. "That's wonderful, Chloe. What's her talent?" "Piano," Chloe said, barely hiding a smirk. "And she's really good." She wrote Anya's name down in neat, careful letters. Then she scanned the list of performance slots. Most of the good ones were taken. But there, at the bottom of the first half, was a golden ticket, the final performance right before the intermission. It was the spot everyone wanted, the one that left the biggest impression on the audience as they went for snacks. It was the perfect spot for a star to be born, or, in Chloe's mind, the perfect spot for a public execution. She neatly wrote piano solo next to Anya's name in that coveted slot. The trap was set. Anya didn't find out from an official source. She was sitting in the cafeteria the next day, picking at a sandwich and trying to be small, when she heard the conversation at the table next to her. It was a group of younger students whispering and giggling. "Did you see the list for the talent show?" One of them said, "Yeah. I can't believe Quiet Anya is signing up for piano, right? That's so random. I've never even heard her talk." The blood drained from Anya's face. Her sandwich suddenly tasted like cardboard. She felt a cold knot form in her stomach. No, it couldn't be true. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, her mind racing. Finally, she forced herself to walk to the main hall, her legs feeling like lead. There it was on the list, in black and white, her name, her talent. And that spot, the final one before the break. It wasn't a mistake. It was a setup. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, exactly who was behind it. Panic set in. Her first thought was to fix it, to erase this horrible mistake before it got any worse. She waited until the last bell, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold her pencil. She found Mr. Davison in his classroom, packing up his briefcase. "Mr. Davison?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up and smiled. "Anya, I was so happy to see your name on the list. Chloe told me you were a bit shy, but I'm so glad you're facing your fear. It'll be good for you." Anya's heart sank. He thought it was real. He thought this was some kind of character-building exercise. I can't do it," she stammered. "There's been a mistake. I didn't sign up." Mr. Davison's smile faltered slightly. He looked at her, his expression kind but firm. "Oh, I know it can be scary, Anya, but everyone gets stage fright. The best way to get over it is to just get out there and do it. We're all rooting for you." He patted her on the shoulder, a gesture meant to be comforting, but it felt like a life sentence. There was no way out. He didn't understand. No one would. The days that followed were a special kind of torture. The news had spread through the school like a virus. Now, wherever she went, she felt the eyes on her. People would whisper when she walked past. In class, someone would make a little ta-da motion with their hands under their desk, and their friends would snicker. The worst was Chloe and her group. They never said anything directly. They would just catch her eye in the hallway and give her a big, fake smile and a thumbs up. It was a constant, low-level hum of humiliation that vibrated just under her skin. Her sanctuary, the old music room, no longer felt safe. Every time she sat down to play, she could almost hear the laughter of the crowd, could feel the weight of their judgment. The music, once her escape, now felt like it was part of the joke. The day of the talent show arrived, and Anya felt like she was walking to her own funeral. The school felt like a giant, waiting mouth, ready to swallow her whole. There was no escape. The day of the talent show felt like a dream, the kind where you're trying to run but your legs are made of concrete. The morning light filtering through her bedroom window seemed too bright, the birdsong outside too cheerful. The world was going on as normal, but for her, everything had tilted on its axis. Getting dressed was a mechanical process. Her hands moving on their own, choosing a plain, dark outfit that she hoped would help her blend into the background, even though she was scheduled to be in the very center of the foreground. Every bite of breakfast tasted like cardboard, and the sound of her own chewing was loud and annoying in the quiet kitchen. Walking into school was like stepping into a pressure chamber. The usual hallway chatter was still there, but now it had a new layer, a low-frequency hum that was all about her. She could feel it on her skin. As she passed groups of students, their conversations would dip for a second, and eyes would follow her. Some looked at her with pity, which was almost as bad as the smirks. Others looked at her with pure, unadulterated curiosity, like she was a strange creature about to be put on display. A freshman she didn't even know gave her a little wave and a wide-eyed, "Good luck tonight." It was meant to be kind, but it felt like another nail in the coffin of her anonymity. The entire school was in on the joke, and she was the punchline. The worst moments were the ones she shared with Chloe, in the hallway before first period. Chloe and her friends were standing by her locker, a move that was clearly intentional. As Anya approached, intending to just grab her book and disappear, Chloe turned to her with a brilliant practice smile. "Anya, hey! We're all so excited for tonight," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "We were just talking about you. It's so brave of you to get out there and share your gift." Her friends giggled, and one of them added, "Yeah, we can't wait to hear what you've been hiding in that music room." They knew. They knew about her sanctuary, and they had turned it into part of the public mockery. Anya just stood there, her hand frozen on the lock of her locker, her throat completely closed up. She managed a tiny, pathetic nod before practically diving into her classroom, her face burning with a shame so deep it felt physical. Every class was an exercise in endurance. She stared at the whiteboard, but the words were just meaningless shapes. Her mind was a frantic, spinning wheel, replaying every possible disaster for the evening. She pictured herself tripping on the stairs to the stage. She pictured her hands freezing completely, unable to press a single key. She pictured hitting a wrong note and the entire auditorium erupting in laughter. The fantasies were so vivid, so real, that she had to physically shake her head to dispel them. The clock on the wall seemed to be mocking her, its hands crawling at a snail's pace, dragging her closer and closer to her doom. The final bell was not a sound of freedom. It was a starting pistol. Most kids cheered and rushed for the doors, eager to go home and get ready for the big night. For Anya, it was the signal to begin the long, slow march toward her own public execution. She didn't go home. She couldn't bear the empty house or the worried look she knew would be on her mother's face. Instead, she found herself wandering the emptying hallways, a ghost in her own school. She ended up back at the door of the old music room, but she couldn't bring herself to go inside. It felt tainted now, violated. The one place where she had felt powerful now felt like the source of her greatest weakness. Hours passed. She sat on a bench near the back of the school, watching the sun dip below the tree line, casting long, spooky shadows across the athletic fields. The lights in the auditorium flickered on, one by one, like a giant waking beast. She could hear distant sounds of people setting up, the faint thud of a bass being plugged in, a burst of feedback from a microphone. Each sound was a jolt to her nervous system. A part of her, a desperate animal part, was screaming at her to just run. To walk out the back gate, keep walking, and never come back. She could disappear. She could start over somewhere where no one knew her as the girl who was forced to play the piano. But her feet felt glued to the spot. Running felt like admitting defeat, like letting Chloe win in the most absolute way possible. And for some reason that felt even worse than the humiliation. Finally, it was time. A teacher found her and gently told her it was time for the performers to gather backstage. The walk to the auditorium was the longest walk of her life. The air backstage was thick and hot, smelling of dust, old velvet curtains, and the sharp, metallic scent of fear. It was a chaotic maze of wires, props, and nervous kids pacing back and forth. Some were stretching, some were muttering lines to themselves, some were laughing with a brittle, high-pitched energy. Anya found a small, dark corner and pressed herself into it. Trying to make herself as small as possible, from behind the heavy curtain, she could hear the audience filing in. The murmur of hundreds of voices grew louder and louder, a rising tide of sound that was about to crash over her. She peeked through a tiny gap in the curtain and saw the sea of faces, a blur of expectation and excitement. And there, in the third row, she saw them. Chloe and her friends, all dressed up, their faces bright under the stage lights. Chloe had her phone out and she was pointing it toward the stage, a wide, predatory grin on her face. She was ready to record everything. One by one, the acts went on. A singer, a magic act, a comedy skit. Each time the curtain closed and the applause died down, Anya's heart beat a little faster. Her hands were so clammy she had to wipe them on her jeans. Her mouth was dry as cotton. She felt like she might be sick. Then she heard the MC's voice, booming through the speakers, announcing the final act before the intermission. And now, for our final performance of the first half, we have a very special treat. Please give a warm welcome to Anya. The name hung in the air for a second. A polite, curious ripple of applause went through the crowd. This was it. There was no more time. A stagehand gave her a gentle nudge toward the curtain. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else as she stepped forward. The heavy curtain parted and a blast of hot white light hit her, blinding her. The walk from the edge of the curtain to the piano in the center of the stage was only about 20 feet, but it felt like 20 miles. Every step was an effort. The entire world had shrunk to this one small circle of light. She could hear her own footsteps, loud and clumsy on the wooden stage. She could hear a few whispers, a couple of scattered giggles. She kept her eyes down, focused on the piano bench, her only goal in the universe. She finally reached it, the polished wood gleaming under the lights. She sat down, the bench feeling cold and hard beneath her. The entire auditorium was silent, waiting. Her hands hovered over the keys, shaking so badly she was afraid they would never stop. For a moment, the world was just a blinding white light and the sound of her own heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She sat on the cold bench, her hands hovering over the keys, shaking so badly she was afraid they would fly away. The auditorium was a dark void beyond the stage, a monster with 1,000 eyes, all fixed on her. She could feel their expectation, a heavy, physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. It was the weight of every snicker in the hallway, every whispered rumor, every moment she had spent trying to be invisible. And now she was the most visible person in the world. A few giggles rippled through the darkness. They were faint, but to her, they sounded like thunder. She knew without looking that Chloe was in the front row, her phone held up, her finger ready to record the disaster. The thought was a bucket of ice water poured over her head. Her fingers, which had been trembling, now felt frozen, stiff, and useless. She couldn't do it. She couldn't press a single key. Her mind was a blank wall of panic. She was going to just sit here, in this horrible silence, until they dragged her off the stage. The humiliation would be complete, then something shifted inside her. It wasn't a sudden burst of courage or a heroic moment. It was quieter than that. It was a small, tired voice in the back of her mind that whispered, "You can't run. So just play." Not for them, not for the crowd, or for Chloe, or for the teachers who thought this was some kind of lesson. Play for yourself. Play for the dusty, forgotten music room. Play for the feeling of the keys under your fingers when the rest of the world disappears. Taking a shaky, deep breath, she did the only thing she could think of. She closed her eyes. The blinding light vanished. The dark void of the audience disappeared. The giggles faded into a distant hum. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she was no longer on a stage. She was back in her sanctuary. She could almost smell the old wood and the faint scent of lemon polish. She could feel the quiet, safe air of the empty room. This was her world. This was where she was in charge. Her frozen fingers began to relax. She lowered them onto the keys, her muscle memory taking over. The first few notes were hesitant, soft, and questioning. They were small, fragile sounds in the huge auditorium, like a single raindrop hitting a tin roof. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats, perhaps disappointed that the show wasn't starting with a crash. But she didn't hear them. She was just feeling her way back, reminding her hands who they were. Then the music began to change. The soft, questioning melody started to gather strength. It became more complex, a thread of sound weaving a story. It was the story of the hallway, of the feeling of being a ghost, of the constant, low-level fear of being noticed. The notes were tinged with a sadness so deep it was almost beautiful. A hush began to fall over the auditorium. The whispers died completely. People who had been leaning back in their seats started to lean forward, drawn in by the raw emotion in the music. It wasn't what they had expected. It wasn't a joke. Anya was lost in it now. Her fingers, no longer shaking, moved with a life of their own. The sad melody began to build, growing louder, faster, more insistent. It was no longer just sad. It was angry. The notes came harder now, a torrent of sound that filled every corner of the room. It was the sound of her books hitting the floor. It was the sound of Chloe's fake sweet voice. It was the sound of every unspoken scream, every moment of frustration she had ever swallowed. The piano was no longer a gentle instrument. It was a weapon, and she was wielding it with fierce, breathtaking skill. The sound was a storm, a tempest of defiance that washed over the stunned audience. In the third row, Chloe's smirk had long since vanished. Her phone, which she had held up to record a fiasco, was now lowered, resting in her lap. She stared at the stage, her face a mask of confusion and disbelief. This wasn't the clumsy, embarrassing performance she had orchestrated. This was incredible. The music was so powerful, so full of a passion she couldn't understand, that it felt like it was physically pushing her back in her seat. She looked around at her friends. Their faces were just as blank, just as shocked. The joke was gone, and in its place was something they had no control over. Something that made them feel small and insignificant. The music reached its peak, a thundering, chaotic crescendo that was the sound of a heart breaking and fighting back all at once. It was the most honest thing anyone in that room had ever heard. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. The angry, loud notes softened, melting into a new melody. This one was different. It wasn't sad or angry. It was clear, strong, and full of a quiet, unbreakable strength. It was the sound of survival. It was the sound of finding your voice, not with words, but with something far more true. It was a promise to herself that she would never be a ghost again. She played this final part of the song with a precision and a grace that seemed impossible. Her hands danced across the keys, no longer fighting the music but flowing with it, a part of it. The entire auditorium was held captive in the palm of her hand, breathing with the music, living in the story she was telling. There was no giggling, no whispering. There wasn't a single sound from the audience. They had been silenced not by force but by pure, undeniable talent and emotion. Finally, her fingers found the last chord. She pressed the keys and a series of deep, resonant notes rang out, filling the space with a profound sense of peace. She held her hands on the keys, letting the sound vibrate through her, through the bench, through the floor of the stage. And then she lifted her hands, and the music stopped. The silence that followed was more powerful, more deafening than any applause. It was a heavy, sacred silence, the kind that falls after a shared, breathtaking experience. It was the sound of 1,000 people holding their breath, not wanting to break the spell. It was the sound of bullies being silenced forever. Anya sat there, her eyes still closed, her hands resting in her lap, and for the first time all day she was not afraid. She was just quiet, and the whole world was quiet with her. The silence in the auditorium was a living thing. It stretched on, thick and heavy, a shared breath held by 1,000 people. Anya sat on the bench, her eyes still closed, her hands resting in her lap. The last vibrations of the final chord were fading, but the feeling of the music still hung in the air like an echo. She wasn't thinking about the audience or the stage or the blinding lights. In the darkness behind her eyelids, there was only the quiet hum of a job finished, a story told. She had poured everything she had into the piano, and now there was nothing left. She was empty, but it was a good kind of empty, a peaceful kind. Then a single person in the back row started to clap. It wasn't a polite, slow clap. It was a sharp, decisive sound like a crack of thunder in a still sky. A moment later, another person joined in. Then another. It was like a chain reaction, a spark that grew into a flame. The clapping spread through the auditorium faster and faster until it wasn't just clapping anymore. It was a roar. A wave of sound so loud and so powerful it seemed to shake the very foundations of the stage, and then they started to stand up. One by one, then in groups until the entire auditorium was on its feet. The roar grew even louder, a deafening, overwhelming wall of sound that was no longer just applause. It was a release. It was an apology. It was a recognition of something so real and so raw that it had transcended a simple school talent show. They were not clapping for a performance. They were cheering for the girl who had bared her soul on that stage. Anya's eyes flew open. The sight that met her was a blur of motion and sound, a sea of standing figures, their faces indistinct in the bright lights. The noise was physical, a force that pushed against her. For a second, the old panic flickered. All this attention, all this noise, it was too much. Her first instinct was to run. But then she saw something that cut through the chaos. In the third row, Chloe was still sitting. Her phone was forgotten in her lap. Her face was pale, her mouth slightly open. She wasn't smirking. She wasn't laughing. She was just staring, her expression a mixture of shock and something that looked a lot like awe. The sight of it, more than the cheering crowd, was what made Anya realize that something had fundamentally changed. She stumbled to her feet, her legs feeling weak and wobbly. She didn't know what to do. She had never practiced a bow. She gave a quick, awkward nod in the direction of the audience, a clumsy, jerky motion. But the crowd didn't care. They just cheered louder. She turned and practically fled from the piano, her heart thumping a wild, frantic rhythm. She needed to get off the stage, to get away from the light and the noise. She stumbled through the heavy curtain and into the cool, dark chaos of backstage. For a moment she just stood there, leaning against a stack of wooden flats, trying to catch her breath. The world on the other side of the curtain was still going crazy, but back here, it was just shadows and wires. Mr. Davison, the teacher who had organized the show, found her there. His eyes were wide and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. "Anya," he said, his voice full of a breathless wonder. I had no idea. I am so sorry. I should have listened to you." He didn't say anything more, just put a gentle hand on her shoulder. It was the validation she hadn't known she needed, a quiet apology that meant more than any standing ovation. Other performers were backstage too. The dancers, the singers, the magicians, they looked at her differently now. Not with pity or annoyance, but with a kind of quiet respect. A few of them gave her small, genuine smiles. No one knew what to say, so they didn't say much, which was fine with her. She just wanted to go home. She found a side door and slipped out into the cool night air, leaving the sounds of the crowd and the beginning of the intermission behind her. The walk home was a blur. She didn't remember the streets or the houses. She just remembered the feeling of the night air on her face and the strange, quiet hum in her own head. The storm was over. The next day at school was the strangest day of her life. Walking down the hallway felt like walking on a different planet. The whispers were still there, but they had changed. When she passed a group of students, she didn't hear snickering. She heard words like, "That was her? And I can't believe that was Quiet Anya." The looks she got were no longer pitying or mocking. They were looks of curiosity, of respect, even of admiration. The true test came when she saw them. Chloe and her friends were standing by their usual spot, holding court as they always did. For a split second, the old fear tightened in Anya's chest. Her first instinct was to lower her head, to make herself small. But she didn't. She kept her head up and kept walking. As she got closer, one of Chloe's friends saw her coming. The girl's smile faltered. She elbowed Chloe, who looked up. Their eyes met for a brief electric second. Chloe opened her mouth as if to say something, but then closed it. The smirk was gone. In its place was a look of uncertainty. Without a word, Chloe and her group turned and walked in the other direction, suddenly very interested in something at the far end of the hall. They didn't just move out of her way. They fled. They had no power here anymore. Anya had a weapon they couldn't possibly understand, and they knew it. Throughout the day, small moments of kindness found her. The boy who sat next to her in math class, who had never spoken to her before, turned and said, "Hey, that was really amazing last night." A girl in the lunch line gave her a genuine, warm smile. People she didn't know were nodding at her in the hallways. She wasn't the most popular girl in school, and she didn't want to be. But she was no longer invisible. She was seen. And for the first time, being seen didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a quiet, peaceful kind of freedom. That afternoon, she found herself walking toward the old music room. It felt different now, less like a hiding place and more like a workshop. She pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The room was just as she had left it, dusty and quiet. The black piano sat in the center of the room, waiting. She sat down on the worn bench, her fingers finding the familiar coolness of the keys. She closed her eyes, but this time she wasn't hiding from the world. She was just getting ready to speak, and then she began to play. The music that came out was not the angry storm of the night before. It was not the sad, lonely melody of her past. It was something new. It was clear and bright, full of a quiet joy and a steady, unshakable strength. It was the sound of a girl who had found her voice, and was just beginning to learn all the things she could say with it. As she played, she heard a soft knock on the door. She didn't stop. She just smiled, a real, genuine smile, and kept playing, ready for whatever came next.